My name is Elena, and the last thing my father ever said to me was, "Go inside and don't come out until morning." I was 12 years old. I stood barefoot on the old wooden porch of our family ranch in northern Colorado, the night air cool against my skin, clutching the hem of my nightgown. The screen door clicked shut behind him with a soft final sound that I would carry for the next 18 years. I never saw his face that night. Just the outline of his shoulders as he walked away into the darkness, leaving me standing there alone under the vast Wyoming sky. That single click became the soundtrack to my childhood wound. For 18 long years, I told myself I was the kind of daughter who could be set aside when she became too much, too curious, too observant, too inconvenient. So I built a life designed to never need anyone again. I'm 30 now. I run a small equine therapy and rescue center just outside Sheridan, Wyoming. Most mornings you'll find me at first light in the corral, my hands resting on the neck of a 1,000-pound horse that's been broken by people it once trusted. There's something sacred about earning the trust of an animal that has every reason not to give it. I've learned that healing doesn't always come with loud declarations or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet moments when a scared creature finally decides you're safe. That's the irony I've lived with for years. I became exceptionally good at being safe for everyone else, while never fully believing that anyone could be safe for me. Last August, I let my best friend Sarah talk me into something I rarely do, a long weekend away at a remote mountain cabin in Colorado. No emergencies, no clients, no ringing phone. Just pine trees, crisp air, and the kind of silence that forces you to sit with yourself. I was sitting on the cabin porch with a mug of coffee going cold in my hands when my phone finally caught a signal and buzzed. The message was from an unknown number. "Come home, don't tell your mother, this is about your father." My stomach dropped so fast I had to set the mug down on the wooden railing. The wind moved through the aspens around me, carrying that familiar scent of sagebrush and earth, and for a moment I was 12 again, standing on that porch listening to a door close. I read the message 3 times, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I'm not the kind of woman who jumps at shadows anymore. I've spent years learning to read the energy in a room, in a horse, in a situation. This wasn't random, this was deliberate. Someone knew exactly what those words would do to me. If you've ever carried a wound from someone who was supposed to protect you, if you've ever built your entire identity around proving you, don't need the people who hurt you, then stay with me. This story is heavy, but I promise the truth at the end is worth every difficult step. Let me tell you a little more about who I am today, so you can understand just how far I had to travel to get here. My work with horses isn't just a job. It's how I learned to trust again. When you spend your days helping traumatized animals find their footing, you start to notice the patterns in your own heart. The way fear makes us freeze, the way patience can rebuild what cruelty tried to destroy. I live in a simple cabin with one chair on the porch because I never wanted to leave space for someone who might decide I wasn't worth keeping. My truck is paid off. My rescue is growing slowly but steadily, and I had convinced myself that this quiet, self-contained life was enough. Until that text message arrived. I sat there on the porch for a long time, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the same colors I remembered from the night my father sent me away. Funny how smells and colors can pull you backward faster than any time machine. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I called Sarah inside and told her I needed to head back early. She didn't ask many questions. She's known me long enough to recognize when something deep is shifting. That night, as I packed my bag under the dim cabin light, I felt the weight of 18 years pressing on my chest. 18 years of believing my father chose everyone else over me. 18 years of proving I could survive without him. I had no idea that the man I had spent nearly 2 decades hating had actually spent those same years fighting silently to protect me. The cruelest thing my father ever did turned out to be the kindest act of love I would ever receive. And what my mother did in response, that's the part that still makes my hands tremble when I think about it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the beginning, to the night when everything changed. Because to understand where I am now, you have to understand the story I told myself for so long. If this already feels familiar to you, if you've ever been the child who was sent away or made to feel unwanted in your own home, type "I'm here" in the comments. You're not alone in this. And I see you. I flew home the next morning, heart pounding the entire way, not knowing that at the airport, a lawyer and 2 investigators would be waiting for me with news that would bring me to my knees on the cold tile floor. That single text message didn't just pull me back to Colorado. It pulled me back into the truth I had been running from my entire adult life. That text message didn't just interrupt my weekend. It cracked open a door I had spent 18 years welding shut. But before we step fully into what happened when I returned to Colorado, I want to tell you about the life I had built, the one I thought was safe, quiet, and completely mine. I live in a small valley outside Sheridan, Wyoming, where the land stretches wide and the sky feels endless. My equine therapy and rescue center, called Stillwater's Ranch, sits on 20 acres I bought with my own money after years of saving and late-night emergency calls. People bring me horses that have been abused, neglected, or simply broken by life. My job is to help them remember they're safe again. Every morning I walk the same path to the barn before the sun is fully up. The air smells like sweet hay, leather, and that crisp mountain chill that wakes you up better than any coffee. I start with Luna, a big chestnut mare who came to me nearly feral 2 years ago. She wouldn't let anyone near her when she first arrived. Now she lowers her head and breathes softly when I rest my forehead against hers. That moment, that quiet trust, is the closest thing I've found to peace. You see, working with horses taught me something profound about myself. I realized I was a lot like them. I had learned to survive by shutting down, by becoming useful instead of vulnerable. I could calm a panicked stallion in the middle of a storm, but I couldn't sit across from someone who said, "I love you," without waiting for the other shoe to drop. My cabin is modest, 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and that single chair on the front porch facing the mountains. I like it that way. 1 chair means I don't have to explain why there's no room for anyone else, no expectations, no risk of being sent away again. I've had relationships, of course, but they never lasted. I always found a reason to pull back before they could get too close. My best friend Sarah says I have trust issues the size of the Rockies. She's not wrong, but she also says I have the steadiest hands she's ever seen. That's what people pay me for, steady hands in the worst moments. When a horse is colicking at 3 a.m. or a new rescue arrives shaking with fear, they call me, because I don't flinch. I've learned not to. That's the thing about being sent away at 12. You learn early that needing people is dangerous, wanting them is even worse. So I became someone who was needed instead, a tool, a helper. A safe place for broken things, but never quite someone who felt wanted just for being herself. I had built a good life on paper. The rescue was slowly growing. I had a small but loyal group of clients who trusted me with their most difficult horses. My truck was paid off. My savings were solid. And most importantly, I had distance. 3 states and 18 years between me and the ranch where I grew up. Or at least I thought I did. That evening on the mountain cabin porch, after reading the text, I told Sarah I needed to leave early. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look only someone who's known you through your hardest years can give. "Whatever this is," she said softly, "you don't have to face it alone." I hugged her and didn't answer, because the truth was I had been facing things alone for so long that I didn't know how to do it any other way. As I drove down the winding mountain road the next morning, the reality started settling in. My father had passed away. That much I understood from the brief call I made to the unknown number before boarding my flight. The lawyer's voice had been calm and careful, the way people speak when they know they're about to deliver news that changes everything. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, just like I do when I'm working with a nervous horse. Breathe in, breathe out, don't let the fear take the reins. But inside, my mind was racing through every possible scenario. Was this about money? Was it some kind of family emergency? Or was it something deeper, something that would force me to rewrite the entire story I had built my identity on? The flight from Denver to the small airport near home felt longer than any journey I'd taken. I stared out the window at the patchwork of fields below and remembered the smell of alfalfa and dust from my childhood, the same fields my father worked every day. The same land that now apparently held secrets I was never supposed to know. By the time the plane touched down, I had rebuilt my walls higher than ever. I reminded myself that I was no longer that 12-year-old girl on the porch. I was Elena, strong, independent, capable. Whatever waited for me at that airport, I would face it the same way I faced every terrified horse, with calm, with clarity, and with boundaries. But nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened next. When I walked through arrivals, a man in a gray suit holding a folder was scanning the crowd. 2 people in plain clothes stood a respectful distance behind him. The moment his eyes met mine, he knew exactly who I was. "Alana," he said gently, "I'm Richard Caldwell. I was your father's attorney." That was the first time I heard someone refer to my father in the past tense. And that was the moment my carefully constructed world began to tilt. I followed them to a quiet corner office the airport staff had cleared for us. My legs felt heavy, like I was walking through deep water. Richard sat across from me, folded his hands, and looked at me with the kind of compassion that told me this was going to hurt. Before he even spoke, I already knew the next words out of his mouth were going to change everything I thought I knew about my father. Richard paused, giving me a moment to breathe. In that quiet airport office, with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my mind did what it always does under pressure. It pulled me back to the one night I had tried so hard to forget. I was 12 years old. It was a warm summer evening on the ranch, the kind where the sky turns that deep lavender right before full dark. I had woken up thirsty and padded downstairs in my bare feet, my old nightgown brushing against my legs. The house was quiet except for low voices coming from my grandmother's study. I shouldn't have stopped to listen, but I did. Through the half-open door, I saw my mother, Diane, and her brother, Uncle Marcus, sitting at the big oak desk. Papers were spread everywhere, bank statements, checkbooks, and documents with my grandmother's shaky signature. My grandmother had been getting frailer, her memory slipping, but she was still the heart of our family ranch. The land had been in her name for decades. I heard my mother say, "We need to make this clean before she gets any worse, for the family." Uncle Marcus nodded, that thin smile on his face. "She trusts us. We just have to guide her." Then they noticed me standing there in the doorway. The air in the room changed instantly. My mother's face tightened. Uncle Marcus leaned back slowly and said in that calm, dangerous voice, "Little girls who eavesdrop sometimes learn things they're not ready to understand." I didn't know what I had walked into, but I felt it in my bones. Something wrong, something secret. The next morning, everything shifted. My father, who had always been the quiet, steady presence in our home, came into my room while I was still half asleep. He didn't sit on the bed like he sometimes did. He stood by the door and said, "Pack a bag, Elena. You're going to stay with Aunt Laura for a while." I asked why. I begged him to explain. He wouldn't look at me. His hands were shaking slightly as he helped me fold clothes I didn't want to take. When I started crying, he just repeated, "It's for the best." That evening, he drove me the 3 hours to my aunt's house in silence. The only sound was the tires on the gravel road and my quiet sniffles. When we arrived, he got out, set my duffel bag on the porch, and said the last words I would hear from him for 18 years. "Go inside and don't come out until morning." He didn't hug me. He didn't say he loved me. He simply turned, got back in the truck, and drove away. I stood there watching his taillights disappear down the long driveway, the screen door of my aunt's house clicking shut behind me just like the one at home. For years I replayed that night in my head, twisting it into a story that made sense to a heartbroken child. I convinced myself that I had done something terrible, that I was the problem, that my father had chosen my mother and Uncle Marcus because I wasn't worth keeping. I never knew that the real reason he sent me away was to protect me. He had seen the same thing I saw that night in the study. He had known for months that my mother and her brother were slowly draining my grandmother's accounts, using her fading health, powers of attorney, and emotional pressure to move money into their own pockets. He was gathering proof, but it was dangerous work, and I had just become a witness. A loose thread in their carefully woven plan. So my father made an impossible choice. He removed me from the situation entirely. He let me believe he didn't want me so that I would stay far away and stay safe. He carried the weight of my hatred for nearly 2 decades because the alternative was risking my life in a fight I was too young to understand. Back in that airport office, Richard's voice brought me gently back to the present. He slid a thick envelope across the table. My name was written on it in my father's familiar, strong handwriting. "This was meant for you only after he was gone," Richard said softly. He was very clear about that. I stared at the envelope, my chest tight. 18 years of anger, confusion, and loneliness were suddenly pressing down on me all at once. I had spent so long being strong, being steady, being the one who didn't flinch, but in that moment I felt like that 12-year-old girl again, small, confused, and desperate for answers. Richard waited patiently while I gathered myself. He told me my father had passed 6 days earlier, a heart attack, sudden but not entirely unexpected. He had been preparing for this moment for a long time. The cruelty of that final door closing all those years ago wasn't rejection. It was love in its most painful silent form. If you've ever been sent away by someone you loved, if you've ever carried the belief that you were unwanted, I want you to hear this clearly. Sometimes the deepest love doesn't look like staying. Sometimes it looks like letting go so you can survive. I didn't cry in that office. Not yet. I simply nodded and asked Richard to tell me everything, because after 18 years of living with a lie, I was finally ready for the truth. And the truth, as it turned out, was far more complicated and far more heartbreaking than I ever imagined. Those first few months after my father drove away were the hardest. I stayed with Aunt Laura, who was kind but careful, like she knew she was holding someone else's broken piece. I stopped asking questions about home after the third time she gently changed the subject. At night I would lie in the guest room and replay that screen door clicking shut, turning my father into the villain of my story, because it was the only way a 12-year-old could make sense of the pain. I decided then that I would never again let someone have the power to send me away. School became my refuge. I threw myself into books and science, anything that felt solid and predictable. Horses had always been part of ranch life, but after I left, they became something more. Aunt Laura had a few old quarter horses, and I started spending every free hour in the barn. There was a gelding named Ranger who had been mistreated before she rescued him. He didn't trust people either. We learned together, slow, patient steps. I learned that trust isn't given, it's earned one quiet moment at a time. By the time I was 16, I had already decided my future. I would work with horses, not on a family ranch where love could be conditional, but in a way that helped heal what people had broken. I worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and pushed through community college before earning my certifications in equine therapy. It wasn't easy. There were nights I cried in my truck after being rejected from programs or after a difficult horse lashed out, but every scar built another layer of the wall around my heart. I became Elena, the woman with steady hands and calm eyes, the one people called when their horse was in crisis. The one who could walk into a pen with a rearing, terrified animal and bring peace without raising her voice. I learned to read body language better than most people read words. A flick of an ear, a tightened muscle, the way eyes soften when fear starts to leave. I applied those same skills to people, keeping them at a safe distance while still being useful to them. I bought my first piece of land at 25 with a loan I paid off in 4 years. Stillwater's ranch started small, just a few paddocks and a modest barn, but word spread. People brought me their most damaged horses, the ones who had been beaten, starved, or abandoned. I never turned one away. In helping them, I was quietly helping the 12-year-old girl who once felt discarded. There were relationships, but they never went deep. I'd date someone for a few months, then find a reason to pull back when they started asking about my family or wanting to meet my parents. I'm better on my own, I would say with a small smile. Inside, I was terrified that if they knew the real story, they would see the same flaw my own parents had seen and leave too. Sarah was the only person who got close. She showed up one day as a volunteer and never really left. She's the one who teases me about my single porch chair and forces me to take weekends away. Without her, I might still be completely sealed off. I told myself this life was enough. I had purpose, I had independence, I had horses that needed me. But deep down, there was always a quiet ache, the question of why my father never once reached out. Not a call, not a letter, not even a message through Aunt Laura. The silence confirmed what I believed. I wasn't wanted. Looking back now, I see how carefully I had armored myself. Every boundary I built was both protection and prison. I could calm a storm inside a horse's mind, but I couldn't sit with the storm inside my own heart. I had become exactly what survival demanded: steady, useful, and emotionally unavailable. That version of me served me well for 18 years. Until that text message on the mountain porch forced me to question everything. As the plane began its descent back toward Colorado, I stared at the familiar landscape below and felt the walls I had built so carefully start to tremble. Part of me wanted to turn around and fly back to Wyoming, the safer choice, the familiar choice. But another part, the part that had stood on that porch at 12 and watched taillights disappear, needed answers. I owed that little girl the truth. Richard met me with kindness and a folder full of documents that would slowly dismantle the story I had lived inside for nearly 2 decades. He didn't rush me. He let me absorb the news that my father had passed, then gently explained that there was so much more I needed to know. My mother and Uncle Marcus had been far more calculated than I ever imagined. Their manipulation of my grandmother wasn't a one-time mistake, it was a long, patient strategy. And my father had been fighting them in silence the entire time. The letter he left me would explain everything, but Richard said I should read it alone, when I was ready. I wasn't ready that day. Instead, I checked into a small hotel near the airport, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the envelope with my father's handwriting. My hands were shaking the same way they did when I first approached a truly dangerous horse. I thought I had built walls strong enough that nothing from my past could touch me again. I was wrong. Those walls were about to come down, not with anger, but with a love so quiet and fierce that it would change how I saw everything, including myself. If you've ever built walls so high that even you can't see over them, I understand. I lived behind mine for 18 years. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let the right person, or the right truth, help you take them down. I sat on that mountain cabin porch longer than I care to admit, the phone still warm in my hand from the text. The words stared back at me. Come home. Don't tell your mother. This is about your father. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of pine and distant rain. For a moment, everything felt suspended. The same way the world goes quiet right before a horse decides whether to trust you or bolt. My heart was racing, but my hand stayed steady. That's what years of working with unpredictable animals teaches you. Control the breath, control the moment. I finally replied with 3 simple words, "Who is this?" The answer came almost immediately. Richard Caldwell, your father's attorney. He passed 6 days ago. There are things you need to know before your mother and uncle handle the estate. Please come quickly and quietly. Those words landed like a hoof to the chest. My father was gone. The man I had spent 18 years resenting, the one I had turned into the villain of my origin story, was no longer alive. And now a stranger was telling me there was more, something big enough to warrant secret messages and warnings about my own mother. I didn't panic. I've learned that panic clouds judgment, and I needed mine clear. I walked inside the cabin, told Sarah I had a family emergency and needed to leave at first light. She hugged me tight without pressing for details. That's the beauty of real friendship. Sometimes silence is the best support. The drive down the mountain and the flight to Colorado passed in a blur of memories I thought I had buried. I kept replaying the last image I had of my father, his back turned, shoulders squared, walking away from me at 12. I had hated him for that. Now doubt was creeping in, soft and dangerous, like a horse testing a new fence line. When the plane landed, I walked through the small terminal with my duffel bag over my shoulder, scanning faces the way I scan a new rescue for signs of trauma. Richard Caldwell spotted me first. He was in his mid-50s, wearing a gray suit that looked slightly rumpled from waiting. 2 investigators stood a respectful distance behind him. "Elena," he said, his voice gentle but serious, "thank you for coming so quickly." We moved to a private airline lounge they had arranged, the kind of sterile room with fake plants and uncomfortable chairs that somehow made bad news feel even heavier. Richard sat across from me, placed a thick folder on the table, and looked me in the eyes. "I'm sorry to do this here," he began. "Your father passed away 6 days ago. He left very specific instructions about how and when you should be told everything." My vision narrowed. The room tilted slightly, the same way it does when a horse suddenly shifts its weight under you. I gripped the edge of the chair. 6 days. He had been gone 6 days and I hadn't felt a thing, because I had trained myself not to. Richard slid the cream-colored envelope toward me. My name was written across it in my father's handwriting, that strong, slightly slanted script I hadn't seen since I was a child. "He wrote this over many years," Richard explained. "He finished it this spring when his health started failing. He was adamant that you not receive it until after he was gone, and certain protections were in place." I stared at the envelope but didn't open it yet. I needed the full picture first. I asked the question that had lived in my chest for 18 years. Why did he send me away? Richard glanced at the investigators, then back at me. His voice stayed calm and measured. "Your father didn't send you away because he didn't want you, Elena. He sent you away to keep you safe from your mother and Uncle Marcus. You walked in on something you weren't supposed to see that night. You became a threat to their plans without even realizing it." The words hit me like cold water. Safe. He sent me away to keep me safe. In that moment, the story I had built my entire identity around began to crack. The man I had called heartless had actually been protecting me the only way he knew how, by becoming the villain. By letting me hate him. By staying silent for nearly 2 decades so I wouldn't come back and put myself in danger. I sat there, breathing slowly, the way I do when I'm working with a horse that's on the edge of panic. One wrong move and everything could shatter. Richard gave me space. He told me more about the financial exploitation of my grandmother, the powers of attorney, the slow draining of accounts that had been happening for years. My mother and uncle had been smart, patient, and ruthless. My father had been documenting everything quietly, building a case while pretending everything was normal. The letter in front of me held the rest. I excused myself for a moment, stepped into the hallway, and leaned against the cool wall. 18 years of anger, shame, and loneliness rushed through me all at once. I didn't collapse, but I felt the weight of that 12-year-old girl inside me finally being seen. If you've ever believed you were unwanted by your own parent, if you've carried that story so long it became part of your bones, then you know how disorienting it is when the truth starts to rewrite everything. I went back into the room, picked up the envelope, and told Richard I was ready to hear the rest. Because after 18 years of silence, the message that pulled me home wasn't just about death or inheritance. It was about a father's love that had been hidden in the hardest, quietest way possible. And I was finally ready to listen. After leaving the airport with Richard, I drove straight to a quiet motel on the edge of town instead of heading to the ranch. I needed one more night to sit with the letter before stepping back into the world that had once broken me. The room was simple, generic, with beige walls and the faint smell of stale coffee. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed the way I used to as a child when the world felt too big. Then I opened the envelope. My father's letter was 23 pages long. The handwriting started firm and confident, slowly becoming more uneven toward the end as his health declined. He wrote like a man who had carried secrets for too long. He described the night I walked into the study, how he had come in from the barn and seen the same thing I saw. He knew immediately what my mother and Uncle Marcus were doing. He had suspected it for months, but that night confirmed it. I had become an eyewitness, and in their eyes, a liability. So he made the choice no parent should ever have to make. He sent me away to Aunt Laura, 3 hours north, and let the story spread that I was difficult, ungrateful, even unstable. He allowed the town to believe I was the problem because it kept me invisible. It kept me safe. I had to let you hate me, Elena, he wrote, because if you loved me, you would have come back, and they would have made sure you never left again. Tears fell onto the pages, blurring some of the ink. I didn't wipe them away. For the first time in 18 years, I let myself feel the depth of his sacrifice. He had chosen my survival over his own relationship with me. He had lived with my silence, my anger, and my absence while quietly building a case against the people he shared a home with. The next morning, I drove toward the ranch. The county road looked exactly the same. Rolling fields, fence lines, and that familiar scent of sagebrush and earth after rain. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the old white farmhouse came into view. My mother was already standing on the porch when I pulled up, as if she had been expecting me. She looked older, her hair more silver, but her posture was still straight and commanding. Uncle Marcus stepped out behind her, heavier now, with the same cold, calculating eyes I remembered. Elena, my mother said, her voice smooth like honey over broken glass. You came back after all. I suppose blood calls blood even after everything. She pulled me into a hug that felt rehearsed. Her arms were stiff, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, the same one she wore all those years ago. When she whispered in my ear, "Don't make a scene. This isn't the time," I felt the old familiar chill run down my spine. I smiled calmly, the same calm I use in the corral. I'm here for Dad's service and the will reading, nothing more. Uncle Marcus watched me like a hawk. Good. Best to keep things simple. Your father left things in order. No need to complicate them. That afternoon, I walked the property alone. The barn, the old corral where I first learned to ride, the back pasture where my father used to let me sit on the fence and watch the sunset. Every inch carried memories, but now those memories were shifting, rearranging themselves around this new truth. Later that evening, my younger brother Tyler showed up. He was 26 now, tall like our father, but with our mother's sharp features. He had grown up hearing only one version of me, the difficult sister who abandoned the family. You shouldn't have come, he said quietly when we were alone by the trucks. Mom and Uncle Marcus have it all handled, the ranch, the accounts, everything. I looked at him carefully. Handled how? He shrugged. Dad signed some papers before he passed. Mom says it's all going to stay in the family the right way. There it was. The first clear sign that my mother and uncle were still playing their game, even after my father's death. They believed they had won. They believed the story they had built was still intact. I didn't correct him. Not yet. Instead, I planted a small seed. Tyler, have you ever seen any actual proof of the things Mom said about me when we were kids, the stealing, the lying, all of it? He hesitated. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. She told me a lot. I was young. His voice trailed off. That small hesitation was enough. The truth was already starting to work on him, even if he didn't realize it yet. The days leading up to the will reading were tense but revealing. My mother tried to play the grieving widow in front of neighbors who stopped by. She spoke about my father with practiced sorrow, while carefully steering every conversation away from me. Uncle Marcus, meanwhile, made his presence felt. A quiet word here, a veiled warning there. One evening behind the equipment shed, he cornered me. "This family has a way of dealing with people who stir up old trouble," he said, his voice low. "Your father learned to keep quiet. You'd be smart to do the same and go back to whatever life you built up north." I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not 12 anymore, Uncle Marcus, and I've spent years learning how to read dangerous animals. You don't scare me." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The power was already shifting, and we both felt it. If you've ever returned to a place that once held power over you, if you've ever faced the people who rewrote your story, without your consent, you know how surreal it feels when you realize you're no longer the scared child they remember. I was no longer running. I was preparing. And the will reading was only days away. The days before the will reading became a careful dance of observation. I moved through the ranch like I moved through a new horse's paddock, slow, watchful, never turning my back completely. Every conversation, every glance, every carefully chosen word from my mother and Uncle Marcus revealed another layer of how deep their manipulation had run. My mother, Diane, had always been masterful at controlling the narrative. She spent those days hosting small gatherings at the farmhouse, playing the devoted widow to perfection. Neighbors brought casseroles and condolences. She would dab at dry eyes and speak about my father in soft, sorrowful tones. Glenn worked so hard to keep this family together, even through the difficult years with Elena. She never missed a chance to remind people of the old story, the one where I was the troubled daughter who had to be sent away for everyone's sake. I sat quietly during these visits, sipping coffee, saying little. I wanted them to think I was still the same girl who left at 12. Let them underestimate me. That was my advantage. Richard had given me copies of key documents before I left the airport. In the motel, that first night, and again in quiet moments at the ranch, I studied them carefully. Bank records spanning more than a decade showed systematic withdrawals from my grandmother's accounts. Powers of attorney signed when her mind was already fading. Transfers disguised as family support or ranch maintenance. The numbers were never huge enough to trigger immediate red flags, but over time they added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. My father had documented everything. He had started a quiet guardianship petition years earlier. He had corresponded with investigators long before anyone suspected. And he had recorded a transfer on death deed for the entire 620-acre ranch in my name back in 2017, 2 years before my grandmother passed. He had been planning this endgame for a very long time. One afternoon, I found my mother in the study, the same rooms where everything had started that summer night. She was going through old files, her movements quick and purposeful. When she saw me in the doorway, she straightened with that familiar tight smile. "Looking for something, Elena?" "Just memories," I said calmly. "This room holds a lot of them." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Some memories are better left in the past. Your father understood that. He made sure the ranch stays protected for the real family." There it was again, the subtle reminder that I was still the outsider, but this time I saw it clearly, the calculation behind her words, the way she tested my reaction. She and Uncle Marcus still believed they controlled the story. They had spent years isolating me, discrediting me, and positioning themselves as the rightful heirs. Later that evening, Tyler found me sitting on the back porch steps. The sun was setting over the fields, painting everything in that soft golden light I remembered from childhood. He hesitated before sitting down a few feet away. "Mom says you've been asking questions," he said quietly, "that you're here to cause trouble." I turned to look at him. He had our father's eyes, steady but currently clouded with confusion. "Tyler, when was the last time you actually saw Grandma lucid enough to sign important papers?" I asked gently. He frowned. "I was pretty young. Mom handled most of that stuff." I didn't push harder. I simply nodded. "Dad left me a letter. When you're ready, I'll share parts of it with you. Not to hurt anyone, just so you know the truth." He didn't answer right away. But I saw the crack forming, that small moment of doubt that truth plants when it's finally given air. My mother had raised him on her version of events. My father had planted quiet seeds in his own way. Through occasional private talks and letters, Tyler was only now beginning to reconsider. Uncle Marcus was more direct. He cornered me again near the equipment shed the next day. His voice was low, almost fatherly, but his eyes were cold. "You've built a nice little life up north," he said. "Smart to keep it that way. Coming back here, digging up old family business, it never ends well for people who don't know when to stop." I met his gaze without flinching. I've spent years working with animals who learn to fear people. I know the difference between a real threat and someone trying to intimidate me. You can stop now. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. The power dynamic that had existed when I was 12 no longer applied. I was no longer a scared child. I was a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. If you've ever had family members who rewrote your history to serve their own interests, if you've watched people you loved manipulate truth until it became unrecognizable, you understand how exhausting it is. But you also understand the quiet strength that comes when you finally see the game clearly. I wasn't there to fight loudly. I was there to let the truth do its work. The will reading was approaching fast. My mother was already rehearsing her performance, certain she would walk away with the ranch, the accounts, and her carefully maintained image intact. She had no idea that my father had spent 18 years making sure that wouldn't happen. And I was ready to stand in that room and watch the layers finally peel away. The night before the will reading, I sat alone in my motel room with the lights low and my father's letter spread across the bed. I had read it so many times the pages were starting to feel soft at the edges. Each reread revealed new layers, not just facts, but the depth of his love hidden in careful strategy. He knew my mother and Uncle Marcus would fight. He knew they would try to discredit me, so he prepared for every possible move they might make. I wasn't going to walk into that farmhouse blindly. Richard and I had spent hours going over the plan. We decided together that I would let my mother have the stage first. Let her perform her version of the grieving widow who had sacrificed everything for the family. Let her repeat the old lies about me in front of the neighbors, the pastor, and whoever else showed up. Only then would the truth come out, calmly, clearly, and with undeniable proof. "You don't have to do this the dramatic way," Richard had said earlier that day. "We can handle most of it through the courts." But I shook my head. I need to be in that room, not for revenge, for closure, for that 12-year-old girl who never got to speak. He understood. He had seen enough families torn apart to know that sometimes the real healing happens when the truth is spoken out loud in the same place the lie was born. I spent that evening walking the back fields alone as the sun went down. The alfalfa was in its second cutting, filling the air with that sweet green scent I had missed more than I realized. I wore my father's old barn jacket that Aunt Laura had kept for me, the one he was wearing the last time I saw him. It still carried a faint trace of him, leather, hay, and the quiet strength I now understood. As I've walked, I practiced what I wanted to say. Not angry words, not accusations, just the truth, delivered with the same steady calm I use when a horse is fighting fear. I reminded myself that I wasn't there to win a fight, I was there to end one. Tyler texted me late that night. "Mom's been talking a lot about how Dad changed the papers at the end. She seems nervous underneath the sad act." I replied simply, "Trust what you feel, not just what you've been told." It was another small seed. I wasn't trying to turn him against her, I just wanted him to start thinking for himself. The next morning dawned gray and still. I dressed in a simple black dress, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed confrontation. I wanted to look like the daughter who came home to say goodbye, not the woman ready to dismantle an empire built on lies. Before leaving the motel, I stood in front of the mirror and looked myself in the eyes. "You are not that little girl on the porch anymore," I whispered. "You are safe, you are strong, and you are finally known." If you've ever had to prepare yourself to face the people who once held power over your story, you know that quiet moment before the storm, the deep breath, the straightening of shoulders, the decision to walk in with truth instead of weapons. I drove to the farmhouse with the windows down, letting the cool morning air fill the truck. When I pulled up, cars were already lining the driveway. Neighbors, a few distant relatives, the pastor. My mother stood on the porch in her best black dress, greeting everyone with practiced grace. Uncle Marcus lingered near the door like a guard. As I walked up the steps, my mother's eyes met mine. For a brief second, I saw something flicker behind her composed mask, uncertainty. She recovered quickly and pulled me into another staged hug. "I'm glad you could make it," she said loud enough for others to hear, "even after everything." I smiled softly. I wouldn't miss it. Inside, the living room had been arranged like a small chapel, folding chairs in rows, the big oak table at the front where Richard would sit. I chose a seat on the side where I could see every face clearly. As people settled in, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. Not because I expected an easy victory, but because I finally understood my father's 18-year silence wasn't abandonment. It was preparation. He had done the hard, invisible work so that when this day came, I would have everything I needed. The truth was already in the room with us, sitting quietly in Richard's folder. My mother took her place at the center, chin lifted, ready to perform. She had no idea that the stage she had set for her coronation was about to become the place where her carefully built story finally unraveled. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. The quiet preparation was over. Now it was time for the truth to speak. The living room felt smaller than I remembered, filled with the low murmur of neighbors and the faint creak of folding chairs. The air carried the familiar mix of coffee, old wood, and that ever-present scent of alfalfa drifting in through the open windows. My mother sat front and center in her carefully chosen black dress, her posture perfect, every bit the picture of a grieving widow ready to receive what she believed was rightfully hers. Richard took his seat at the oak table, his folder closed in front of him. He looked calm and professional, exactly as we had planned. I sat a few rows back on the side, hands resting quietly in my lap, observing everything. Uncle Marcus stood near the doorway like a sentinel, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. Tyler sat near the back, looking uncomfortable, caught between the only family he had really known and the growing doubts I had planted. My mother rose first, as I knew she would. She didn't wait for Richard to begin. This was her stage, and she intended to set the tone. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft but carrying that practiced tremble of sorrow. "This has been such a difficult time for our family. Glenn worked so hard for this ranch for all of us. Even when things were challenging, especially with Elena leaving us the way she did all those years ago." She glanced in my direction without fully looking at me, a move designed to invite sympathy from the room. "We tried everything with her," she continued, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "But some children are just difficult. We had to make hard choices to protect the family. I stood by Glenn through all of it, and now I know he wanted the ranch to stay with those who never abandoned it." A few neighbors nodded sympathetically. The pastor patted her arm gently. The old story was landing exactly as it always had. I sat perfectly still, breathing slow and steady, the same way I do when a horse is testing boundaries. Let her speak. Let every word be recorded in the minds of the people in this room. She went on for nearly 15 minutes, painting a beautiful narrative of sacrifice, loyalty, and a troubled daughter who had finally returned too late. She spoke about how my father had come to his senses in his final weeks and made sure the ranch would stay protected under her care. Uncle Marcus occasionally nodded in agreement, reinforcing the performance. I watched Tyler's face. He shifted in his seat, eyes flicking between our mother and me. The seeds were working. When she finally sat down, satisfied that she had framed the entire reading in her favor, she gave Richard a small nod, the signal that he could now hand over what she believed was her kingdom. Richard stood slowly. He opened the folder with deliberate care. The room grew quieter. "Before we proceed with the formal reading," he said in his measured lawyer's voice, "there are several important documents I need to share with all of you. Documents that Glenn Frell prepared over many years." My mother's expression remained composed, but I noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. She still thought this was a formality. Richard began with the transfer on death deed my father had recorded in 2017. He read the language clearly. The entire 620-acre ranch, the home, the barns, and all associated water rights would pass directly to me, Elena Frell, upon my father's death. It superseded any later will or transfer. The room shifted. Whispers moved through the small crowd like wind through grass. My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "That can't be right," she said, her voice rising. "Glenn signed new papers just weeks before he passed. Everything was supposed to come to me and Tyler. This is some kind of mistake." Richard remained calm. "There is no mistake, Diane. The deed was properly recorded years ago. Your husband made sure of it." I sat quietly, watching the first cracks appear in the facade she had maintained for nearly 2 decades. This was only the beginning. If you've ever watched someone's carefully constructed reality start to unravel in real time, you know how surreal the moment feels. I didn't feel triumphant yet. I felt the weight of my father's long silence finally lifting. The truth was no longer hidden. It was standing in the middle of the room with us. The tension in the room thickened instantly. My mother's face flushed with a mix of shock and anger she could no longer fully hide. She stepped forward, her voice sharper now, losing some of that practiced grief. "This is fraud," she declared, looking around at the neighbors and the pastor for support. Glenn was sick. He wasn't in his right mind those last months. Elena must have influenced him somehow. She always knew how to manipulate situations. Her words hung in the air. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Uncle Marcus moved closer to her side, his jaw tight, ready to back her up. I remained seated, hands still folded, breathing steadily. I had waited 18 years for this moment. I wasn't going to rush it. Richard continued calmly as we had rehearsed. He laid out more documents, certified bank records showing years of suspicious transfers from my grandmother's accounts. Powers of attorney signed during periods when medical reports clearly showed her cognitive decline. Correspondence between my father and investigators dating back years. Then he read from my father's letter. Not the entire thing, just the parts that mattered most in that room. Glenn wrote, "I sent Elena away, not because I didn't love her, but because I did. I saw what was happening with Diane and Marcus. I couldn't protect her and gather the proof at the same time, so I chose her life over my relationship with her. I let her hate me so she could grow up safe and far from this." A heavy silence fell over the room. The pastor's hand froze on my mother's shoulder. Neighbors exchanged wide-eyed glances. Tyler stared at the floor, his face pale. My mother's mask cracked completely. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice rising into a register I rarely heard. "That girl was always causing problems. She saw things she shouldn't have and twisted them. We were protecting the family." I stood up slowly, not loud, not angry, just steady the way I stand when a horse is rearing in fear. The room turned toward me. "I was 12, I said quietly, my voice carrying through the space. "I walked into the study and saw you and Uncle Marcus going through Grandma's papers. That's all I did. And the next morning, Dad sent me away. Not because I was difficult, but because he was trying to keep me alive and away from whatever you two were planning." I looked directly at her. "He spent 18 years documenting everything so I wouldn't have to grow up in the middle of it. He chose to be hated by me so I could have a chance to become who I am now." Uncle Marcus tried to interrupt, his voice low and threatening. "This is family business. It doesn't need to be aired out here." But Richard spoke over him. "Actually, it does, because there is an active investigation into the financial exploitation of Nadine Frell, and several people in this room may be asked to provide statements." That was when Detective Ramirez and her partner stepped quietly into the back of the room. They hadn't made a big entrance, just enough presence to change the temperature of the entire gathering. My mother's performance collapsed. The tears that had looked so convincing earlier now seemed desperate. She turned toward me with outstretched hands, switching tactics in a heartbeat. "Elena, honey, we're still family. We can work this out together. No lawyers, no police. Just us. The ranch belongs to all of us." For one brief second, I saw the frightened woman she must have been long ago, the one terrified of losing control and power. But that second passed quickly. "There's no us in the way you mean," I replied softly. "The records belong to the truth now. The land remembers who protected it, and I remember who tried to take it." Tyler stood up from his seat near the back. His voice was unsteady but clear. "Mom, all these years you told me Elena was the one who ruined everything, that Dad sent her away because she was bad, but I never saw any proof, not once." He didn't fully side with me in that moment, but the simple act of speaking up in front of everyone was enough. The old story was fracturing right there in the living room where it had been born. If you've ever watched someone who once held power over your life lose their grip in real time, you know it's not loud cheering or dramatic victory. It's a quiet, heavy shift. Like a horse finally exhaling after years of holding tension in its body. My mother looked smaller suddenly. The room that had been nodding along with her grief was now seeing her clearly, perhaps for the first time. Richard closed the folder gently. "This concludes the formal part of the reading. The legal process will continue, but the deed stands. The ranch belongs to Elena." The screen door creaked softly in the breeze, letting in the sweet smell of the fields. In that moment, standing in the same house where I had once been sent away, I felt the 18-year weight finally begin to lift from my chest. The mask had fallen. And the truth was standing naked in the room for everyone to see. The room didn't erupt into chaos. That's not how real life works. Instead, it filled with a heavy, uncomfortable silence broken only by the sound of chairs shifting in quiet murmurs. My mother stood frozen for a moment, then turned toward me with a look that mixed desperation and fury. "Elena, please," she said, her voice dropping into that soft, pleading tone she used so well. "You've always been so quick to judge. We were protecting the family. Your father was confused at the end. We can still fix this. Come home. We'll divide everything fairly. You, me, Tyler, we're blood." She reached out like she wanted to hug me again, the same way she had on the porch when I first arrived, but this time her hands were trembling. I stepped back gently but firmly. "Blood didn't protect me when I was 12, Mom, and it won't rewrite what Dad spent 18 years documenting." Uncle Marcus moved closer, his presence heavy and intimidating. He lowered his voice so only I could hear. "You think you're smart coming back here with your fancy lawyer and papers? This family eats people who stir up trouble. Your father learned that the hard way. You should get back in your truck and return to those horses before things get ugly." I looked him straight in the eyes, the same way I look at a horse that's trying to test me, calm, unshaken. "I've spent years working with animals who were taught to fear people like you," I said quietly. "I know the difference between real danger and someone who's losing control. You don't get to threaten me anymore. Everything that happens from this point forward is being documented. The investigators are already here." Detective Ramirez stepped forward at that moment, her voice professional and steady. She reminded everyone present that there was an active investigation and advised anyone involved to speak with their own attorneys before saying anything further. The shift in power was palpable. Uncle Marcus's face hardened, but he took a step back. For the first time, he looked like what he was, a man whose long game was finally catching up to him. My mother's performance had completely unraveled. The grieving widow everyone had sympathized with earlier now looked exposed in front of the very people whose opinions she had cared about most. Tyler stood quietly by the window. He didn't say much more, but he didn't rush to defend her either. That small space he was creating for the truth mattered more to me than any dramatic declaration. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. The truth, backed by my father's careful work over nearly 2 decades, spoke louder than any shouting match ever could. This wasn't about destroying them. It was about finally stepping out of the story they had written for me. As people began to leave, offering awkward condolences and avoiding eye contact with my mother, I walked out onto the porch, the same porch where my father had sent me away all those years ago. The screen door creaked behind me, just like it had that night, but this time I was the one closing it on the past. My mother followed me outside. For a moment she dropped the act completely. Her shoulders sagged, and her voice was raw. "I did what I had to do," she whispered. "You don't know what it's like to feel powerless." I turned to look at her one last time. "And you don't know what it's like to be sent away by the one person who was trying to save you. I'm not here to take revenge, Mom. I'm here to live the life Dad made sure I could have." She didn't have an answer. For once, the woman who always controlled the narrative had nothing left to say. If you've ever faced the people who hurt you and realized you no longer needed their validation or their fear, you understand the strange mix of grief and freedom in that moment. It wasn't joyful. It was peaceful, like finally releasing a horse that had been tied up for too long. The confrontation was over. The real work, the legal battles, the healing, the rebuilding was just beginning. But for the first time in 18 years, I wasn't carrying their version of me anymore. I was free to write my own. The days after the will reading passed in a quiet blur of legal meetings and long walks across the land. The ranch was mine, not just on paper but in a deeper sense. I walked the 620 acres slowly, feeling the weight of my father's 18-year silence finally settle into something like peace. The alfalfa fields stretched out under the wide Colorado sky, swaying gently in the breeze, carrying that sweet green scent that had always meant home, even when home had hurt me. Richard handled most of the immediate paperwork. The transfer on death deed held strong. My mother tried to challenge it, of course. She filed for her elective share as the surviving spouse and hired an attorney who tried to argue my father lacked capacity when he recorded the deed. But the evidence my father had carefully gathered over the years was too solid. Medical records, dated correspondence, and witness statements painted a clear picture of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I didn't fight her aggressively. I didn't need to. The law, my father's quiet strategy, and the truth were already doing the heavy lifting. She would receive a portion of certain joint accounts as the law required, but the heart of the ranch, the land itself, remained protected in my name. One afternoon, I found Tyler sitting on the fence near the back pasture. He looked tired, older than his 26 years. We sat in silence for a while, watching a small herd of horses graze. "I read parts of Dad's letter," he said finally. "The one he left for me too. He wrote to me separately, you know. Told me to look closer at things when I was ready." I nodded. He was protecting both of us in different ways. Tyler looked out at the fields. "All these years, Mom told me you were the reason everything fell apart, that you chose to leave. I believed her because it was easier." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry, Elena." I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "You were a kid. We both were, in our own ways. The important thing is you're seeing clearly now." That conversation didn't fix everything between us, but it opened a door. For the first time, I felt like I might have a brother again, not the version my mother had shaped, but the real one. My mother and Uncle Marcus kept their distance after that day. The investigation continued its slow grind through the system. There would be no quick, tidy ending. These things take time, court dates, depositions, and more paperwork. But the truth was on record, and that was enough for me. I spent 2 weeks on the ranch handling immediate matters. I walked through the old house, touching the walls and furniture that held so many memories. In my father's small office, I found more notes he had written, little reminders to himself about what to document next. Every page felt like a quiet message. "I never stopped loving you." On my last evening there, I put on his old barn jacket again and walked out to the far pasture alone. The sun was setting in that perfect golden light, painting the mountains in soft pinks and oranges. I sat on the same fence where he used to lift me up as a little girl. I pulled the final page of his letter from my pocket and read it one more time. "I hope one day you understand that sending you away was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was also the thing I'm most proud of. You grew up strong and kind and capable. You became someone who helps heal broken things. That was always enough for me." Tears slipped down my cheeks, but they weren't bitter anymore. They were grateful. I had reclaimed more than the ranch. I had reclaimed the truth about who my father really was. A man who loved me so deeply, he was willing to let me hate him if it meant keeping me safe. If you've ever lost years with someone because of lies and secrets, if you've ever wondered whether you were truly wanted, I hope this part of the story reaches you. Sometimes the people who love us most do it in ways we can't understand until much later. The ranch was no longer a place of pain. It was becoming a place of possibility. As the last light faded over the ranch that evening, I stayed on the fence for a long time, my father's jacket wrapped around me like a quiet embrace. The grief didn't disappear. I don't think it ever fully will. But for the first time in 18 years it felt different, no longer sharp and accusing, but heavy with love and understanding. I finally saw my father not as the man who abandoned me, but as the man who sacrificed everything so I could become the woman sitting there on his land. I thought about the 12-year-old girl who stood on the porch watching taillights disappear. I whispered to her, "He loved you. He always loved you." And in that moment, something deep inside me softened and released. The next morning, I said my goodbyes. Tyler and I shared a quiet hug. There's still work to do between us, but we're no longer strangers carrying different versions of the same story. My mother didn't come out to see me off. That was okay. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, only understood and left behind. I drove away from the ranch with the windows down, the warm wind carrying the scent of alfalfa and possibility. The screen door of the farmhouse clicked shut behind me one final time, but this time it was my hand on it. I was choosing to close that chapter with peace instead of pain. Back in Wyoming, Still Waters Ranch welcomed me home. Luna greeted me at the gate, pressing her forehead against my chest like she always does when I've been gone too long. As I stood there with her, breathing in the familiar barn smells, I realized how much I had changed. I was no longer just surviving. I was ready to live, maybe even leave space for more than one chair on the porch someday. If you've ever been the child who was sent away, if you've ever believed you were unwanted, unloved, or too much, I want you to hear this clearly. Sometimes the people who love you best do it in the hardest, quietest ways. They choose your safety over their comfort. They carry your hatred so you can carry your future. And one day, if you're lucky, the truth finds you and sets everything right. You were never the problem. The story they told about you was. Type healing in the comments if this story touched something deep inside you. Type I understand now if you've ever had to rewrite the narrative of your own life. And if you're still carrying pain from someone who chose to protect you by letting you go, be gentle with yourself. Healing doesn't always come with apologies or second chances. Sometimes it comes in the quiet realization that you were loved better than you ever knew. Thank you for sitting with me through all of this, for listening to the heavy parts and staying until the light broke through. These stories matter because they remind us that even in the most painful family secrets, there can be profound love hidden underneath. My father loved me in silence, in paperwork, in 18 years of letting me hate him so I could grow up breathing free. And I would trade every acre of that ranch for one more chance to tell him I finally understand. But since I can't, I'll live the life he protected. I'll keep healing broken things, horses and people alike, and I'll leave the porch chair ready just in case. Until the next story, take care of the little one inside you who once felt unwanted. They deserve to know they were always deeply loved.